You're now watching Around the Horne, the weekly internationalist news update with author and historian Gerald Horne.
Today is July 16th, 2025. Welcome everyone to the weekly series entitled Around the Horne, which is an internationalist news update with historian and Professor Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne's latest book, which was just released and is now in print and now available on the International Publisher's website, is entitled The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., from 1800 to 1865. Dr. Horne is also a permanent guest on the radio show, The Horne Report, which airs on Black Power 96 Radio on Sundays at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and Dr. Horne also hosts a radio show entitled Freedom Now, which airs on KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Pacific. And replays of both shows can be found on the Activist News Network. And on the anniversary of the Cuban Revolution, July 26th, Dr. Horne will be speaking in honor of the revolution at 7 p.m. at 600 Campbell Avenue in Vancouver, British Columbia. Lastly, we want to wish the revolutionary Assata Shakur happy 78th birthday. Dr. Horne, thank you for coming back on the show, and welcome back to Around the Horne.
Thank you for inviting me.
Horne, as we go around the horn, first want to ask you about the U.S.-NATO proxy war against Russia. On July 11th, U.S. President Trump announced during a meeting with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte that the U.S. will send Patriot missiles to Ukraine to help it defend itself against Russian attacks. While President Trump did not give a number of Patriots he plans to send to Kiev, he stated that the European Union was, quote, going to pay us 100% for that, and that's the way we want it. President Trump also threatened to impose severe secondary tariffs on Russia if the two sides fail to reach an agreement to end the war. Secondary tariffs are on countries that do business with the targeted country. President Trump said, quote, we're going to be doing secondary tariffs if we don't have a deal in 50 days. It's very simple, and they'll be at 100%. Dr. Horne, what is your reaction to this news of President Trump threatening to send weapons to Ukraine and threatening secondary tariffs on Russia if there is no ceasefire deal?
Well, I think it represents the major theme for today, which is contradiction. On the one hand, a slight glance indicates that Mr. Trump may be leading the small planets to the brink of World War III. What I mean by that is that David Ignatius of the Washington Post, who is a kind of stenographer for the Central Intelligence Agency, has had a column in the last few days where he suggested that Mr. Trump would also consider sending Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine that can reach deeply into Russia. According to other press accounts, Mr. Trump has encouraged the regime in Ukraine to consider hitting Moscow and St. Petersburg as well, the two major cities in Russia, in order for these missiles to be launched. Because of their technological complexity, it undoubtedly would involve U.S. technicians pulling the trigger. That is to say that U.S. authorities are launching missiles into Russia, and it would be understandable if Russia were to respond in kind in attacking, for example, New York and Washington. This is utterly dangerous, but the contradiction is this 50-day limit that Mr. Trump supposedly tossed out, because there are other commentators who suggest that that is a code and a signal for Moscow to wrap up this special military operation in Ukraine, to finish the job within 50 days, which is quite doable if you look at the trajectory of the latest Russian offensive, which would then preclude the necessity for sending cruise missiles, or heaven forfend, launching cruise missiles with U.S. technicians pulling the trigger. But it's still rather dangerous, because we know that the special military operation was launched a few years ago because of this idea that Ukraine would join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and bring to fruition what we're talking about now. That is to say, a NATO attack on Russia. And so seemingly and rather brazenly, Mr. Trump is moving the United States and NATO towards that ominous end. Now, we need to also consider this contradiction that Mr. Trump, who came into office promising and pledging to decouple Russia from China by edging closer to Moscow, now is emulating the Biden strategy, which drove Russia and China closer together. And I think it's also fair to say that what's happening with regard to U.S. policy in the international community is a reflection of the contradictions domestically. And the fact that the Republican Party, and in fact the U.S. ruling class as a whole, is heavily factionalized. That is to say that we see this factionalizing play itself out with regard to the Jewish question, for example, which brings us to the scandal involving Jeffrey Epstein and this idea that there is a fragmentation of the Trump base, a contradiction between the orange pompadour Fuhrer and his base over the fact that Mr. Trump, after promising and pledging to release files on the scandal-ridden pedophile, the late Mr. Epstein, is now retreating. Now, what really puzzles me is why the Attorney General, Pam, or Scam Blondie, to use the name that's now being tossed around, has refused to take the obvious route, which is to redact the file dramatically, blacking out any references, for example, to Mr. Trump, and then releasing said documents, inviting litigation, tying up the litigation with frivolous motions until it reaches the Supreme Court, which will then issue a judgment vindicating Mr. Trump, and in fact, probably, if possible, rolling back altogether the Freedom of Information Act. I'm not sure why they're not pursuing that particular approach. But in any case, with regard to the theme of this particular program, what we need to focus on is the fact that Jeffrey Epstein was quite close to Israel, as Tucker Carlson, the right-wing commentator, has pointed out. It's unclear whether or not he was an intelligence asset for Israel, but it's apparent that A, he was close to former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, that B, his procurer, if I can use that term, now in prison, Ghislaine Maxwell, is the daughter of the late Mossad asset, speaking of the billionaire Robert Maxwell, who somehow fell off his yacht mysteriously and drowned, and then had a funeral in Israel attended by the prime minister and the president, and then was buried in the equivalent of the Pantheon in Israel. Not to mention the fact that Mr. Epstein, who started off as a secondary school math teacher before owning the largest residence in Manhattan, was bankrolled by Les Wexner, who founded, among other corporations, Victoria's Secret, a billionaire very close to Israel himself. And so the fact that apparently the divorce of billionaire Bill Gates was sparked in part by his spouse, Melinda French Gates, being upset with his being close to Jeffrey Epstein, the fact that Mr. Trump himself has been known to be close to Mr. Epstein. In fact, Mr. Epstein said that Mr. Trump was one of his closest friends. And so this raises questions as to whether or not Mr. Epstein was used to blackmail various billionaire personalities and other powerful figures, not least the United States of America. But in any case, this also reveals the contradiction in the Trump base between the open anti-Semites, such as Nick Fuentes, the supposed and actual white nationalist right-winger, and those like Mike Huckabee, an emblem of the Christian evangelist, who is now the U.S. ambassador to Israel, and of course is known as being Philo-Semitic. And it also opens the question as to how the Zionists were able to destabilize the prime minister in waiting in London, speaking of Jeremy Corbyn, on the spurious grounds of his being anti-Semitic and the weaponizing of anti-Semitism in order to destabilize forces to the left, which is now being trotted out against Zoran Mamdani, the Democratic Socialist, contending to be mayor of New York City. I think it's also fair to say that in addition to the Epstein scandal shaking the Trump base and perhaps causing Mr. Trump to edge closer to the neocons, who supposedly many in the Trump base are opposed to, and that helps to shed light on his turnabout with regard to Russia policy. The base, at least, was not unanimous with regard to the ill-fated, ill-advised 12-day war against Iran. We also know that the corporate media is quite hostile to the idea that Mr. Trump would edge closer to Russia, and these aforementioned issues, the Epstein scandal, the 12-day war, opened the door for them to push more aggressively against Mr. Trump with regard to foreign policy, which then brings me to another question that I must say has had me a bit befuddled. Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia, gave a recent interview where he suggested that he, like others, he says, in Russia, thought that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, that the tensions and contradictions between Russia and the North Atlantic countries could be resolved. And I was puzzled by that because apparently he's not familiar with the recent scholarship. For example, the book by Barbara Emerson, The First Cold War, on the tensions between London and Russia in the 19th century. One could say the tensions between London and Russia and France and Russia in the 19th century. Or to issue a point of personal privilege, he didn't see the essay that I wrote in my book. I dare say perhaps someone could send Mr. Putin a copy of this particular book with a check mark behind my essay on Russia, where I point out that there is a fundamental contradiction stretching back centuries in Europe. That is to say, as the Western European nations were getting fat off the plunder of Africa and the Americas, they were not necessarily the major power in their backyard in the continent of Europe, which leads to Napoleon's attempt to resolve this contradiction 200 years ago with an invasion of Russia, where he was soundly defeated, and led to the Crimea War of the 1850s, where Russia, France, and Ottoman Turkey gang up on Russia. It leads to Britain sponsoring the Japanese attack on Russia in 1904. It leads to, of course, Operation Barbarossa, June 22nd, 1941, with the Nazis attacking Russia. It leads to the Cold War itself. And so there were fundamental contradictions between the Soviet Union and Russia on the one hand, and the North Atlantic camp on the other, that the simple collapse of the Soviet Union would not resolve. And I think that better late than never with regard to Mr. Putin coming to this realization, which brings us to the threatened sanctions that Mr. Trump will slap on those who trade with Russia. This is a reference to the bill introduced with 80 co-sponsors in the U.S. Senate, brought to the floor by Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, bipartisan, as they say in Washington, which would issue what Mr. Graham calls bone-crushing sanctions against nations that trade with Russia unless this Ukraine special military operation is not wrapped up rather shortly. The contradiction there is the United States does billions of dollars in trade with Russia, admittedly, most of that being exports from Russia to the United States. So is the United States going to put bone-crushing sanctions on itself? Not to mention the fact that, are they really seriously talking about putting sanctions on China after Mr. Trump retreated ignominiously from that kind of escapade just weeks ago? Are they really seriously talking about putting bone-crushing sanctions on India yet another major trading partner of Russia, given the fact that US imperialism needs India in order to somehow encircle and confront the People's Republic of China. So I have to say that in terms of resolving the contradictions of this latest gambit from the White House, on the one hand, it's performative, it's not serious. But the problem is that when you're flirting with World War III, any mishap could tip the balance towards that kind of fiasco, towards that kind of debacle, which means that we in the anti-imperialist movement must take this rather seriously. And one more point on the question of factionalism before we turn our attention to the next issue. The problem there for those of us in North America, particularly in the United States of America, is that even though there are contradictions and tensions amongst the different factions in the right wing and even in the MAGA base, what tends to unite them is something that was revealed in the Washington Post just a day or two ago, when the billionaire investor, a man who could be called the king of Silicon Valley, speaking of Mark Andreessen, said that a major problem for the United States today, as we speak, is DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is code for Black people, and immigration, particularly, although he did not say it, from south of the border, which is code for brown people. And so we know that historically, the billionaire class, the 0.0001%, has been able to deflect attention away from their many transgressions by turning the energy of the Euro-American working class and middle class towards those with whom they purportedly occupy a similar class trench. That is to say, Black and brown workers, Black and brown middle class elements. That particular approach has been quite successful in the recent past, in the distant past. And that is the problem with regard to looking blithely at these contradictions between and amongst those in the Trump base, because they can unite with regard to white supremacy. They can unite with regard to anti-Black racism in particular.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we want to ask you about Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's trip to China. In a complex world of shifting alliances, Prime Minister Albanese went to China this past Saturday, July 12th, for 6 days. While Prime Minister Albanese is likely confident that most Australians back the government's handling of relations with the country's most important economic partner and the leading strategic power in Asia, Albanese's domestic critics have lambasted him for meeting Chinese leader Xi Jinping before meeting with U.S. President Trump. His critics are also aggrieved at his refusal to label China a security threat, and senior Pentagon official Elbridge Colby took to social media, saying the U.S. administration wanted allies, including Australia, to, quote, step up their defense spending after a Financial Times report suggested Trump demanded assurances from Australia and Japan about military deployments in the event of a war over Taiwan. Dr. Horne, how significant is Prime Minister Albanese's trip to China to meet with President Xi, particularly in a changing global correlation of forces?
Well, this represents the kinds of contradictions that I was just referring to. On the one hand, you see Mr. Albanese, who, as suggested, has just broken bread with Chinese leaders in Beijing. On the other hand, Australia has not broken away from its alliance, its militaristic alliance with U.S. imperialism, which you may recall also involves spending billions in Australian tax dollars for U.S. manufactured submarines that obviously will be targeting the People's Republic of China. This contradiction is also reflected in European Union policy with regard to U.S. imperialism. On the one hand, you have the spectacle of the former Dutch Prime Minister, now Secretary General of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, speaking of Mark Rutte, who quite infamously referred to Trump as Daddy Trump on the one hand, in a particularly servile and obsequious approach to the commander-in-chief of U.S. imperialism. On the other hand, the European Union, and of course there is a kind of overlap between the European Union and NATO, is quite concerned, to put it mildly, about these proposed tariffs that Mr. Trump is considering slapping on the EU. And it's no secret that the EU would like to supplant US imperialism as the hub of global capitalism. After all, they have a bigger market than the United States of America. After all, they have a common currency, the euro, which they would like to see replace the dollar. And in that regard, pay attention to this recent summit in London between the leaders of France and Britain. Now, of course, understandably, we routinely refer to London in particular as being a poodle of US imperialism. And understandably, we refer to Mr. Macron of France as being full of hot air. He's a master of the Michael Jackson maneuver known as moonwalking, where he seems to be moving forward and confronting imperialism in Washington, but actually is either standing still or moving backwards. But having said that, they inked the pact, the so-called Northwood Declaration, which a commentator in the Wall Street Journal just a few days ago said was an announcement that these two juggernauts of Europe, speaking of Britain and France, are seeking to decouple from US imperialism without announcing it. I guess without announcing it, that presumably will not bring them within the crosshairs, will not lead to enhanced added pressure by US imperialism. So once again, in terms of our theme, this is the contradiction. This is the theme, the contradictions of the global order today, the contradictions of the present conjuncture, which on the one hand makes it a bit more difficult to analyze the flow of history, for example. But on the other hand, I think that it inevitably creates opportunities for the anti-imperialist movement worldwide.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to ask you about Algeria and Morocco. Dr. Horne, it seems that we need to pay closer attention to developments in the Maghreb, particularly between Algeria and Morocco, not to mention Western Sahara. It appears that Algeria is being squeezed by Morocco, as well as France and, of course, the U.S. In addition, there appear to be growing attempts to turn the Sahel countries, particularly Mali, against Algiers as well. And as per usual, the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, seems to be part of this plot. Dr. Horne, considering the long and sordid history between Algeria and Morocco, why should we be paying closer attention to developments between these two countries, and what, if any, implications does these developments have on the region and beyond?
Well, I think we in the United States and progressive movement have a particular debt of gratitude towards Algiers. Recall that it was in 1962 when Algeria sourced independence that the leader of that era, speaking of Ben Bella, embraces literally and figuratively the anti-Jim Crow movement and its emblem, speaking of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We know that a few years later, Algiers opened an embassy in that particular Mediterranean city that housed the international legation of the Black Panther Party. We know that Amilcar Cabral, who was a founding father of independent Guinea-Bissau and whose writings are still worth perusing. I particularly recommend the slim volume Return to the Source. He said at the time that Catholics flocked to the Vatican, Muslims flocked to Mecca, and revolutionaries of African descent flocked to Algiers. But now we have the spectacle of Algeria being encircled by its frequent jousting partners, speaking of its neighbor, Morocco, over this question of the Western Sahara, a former Spanish colony, which Morocco has gobbled up and has not only been able to gain support from Britain and France, but also quite recently, Jacob Zuma, the former president of South Africa, who now has his own party, the so-called MK party, was recently in Rabat endorsing Morocco's attempt to seize Western Sahara. And given the fact of Mr. Zuma's corruption, I'm sure there is a payoff somewhere along the line. And of course, the scandal-ridden William Ruto, now under siege in Nairobi for weeks now. And I dare say it would not surprise me at all if he's driven out of office sooner rather than later because of protests over rising prices and rising taxes, and not to mention gross violations of civil liberties. He too has embraced the Moroccan position with regard to Western Sahara. And we need to elaborate further on the United Arab Emirates, which is becoming a major villain when it comes to interfering in the internal affairs of African nations. Look at what it's been doing in Sudan of late, for example. But we really don't not necessarily have to go all the way to the UAE to pick out villains when it comes to African affairs. Recall that last week we talked about this so-called mini-summit at the White House featuring Mr. Trump and leaders of Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, Gabon, Liberia, Mauritania, etc., with once again a servile approach to Mr. Trump taken by all assembled. And I was particularly disappointed by the fact that the leadership of Senegal saw fit to send their president to this gathering, because many of us campaigned to see the ouster of President Faye's predecessor. Speaking of Macky Sall, we expected more, I'm afraid to say, from Dakar. And what we did not mention last week, but is becoming ever evident with every passing second, is the fact that part of the agenda of this mini-summit was to find a landing space for undocumented workers from the United States to be deported to. Just today, it was reported that some of these undocumented have been sent to the southern cone of Africa, to the nation now known as Eswatini, once known as Swaziland, an absolute monarchy, by the way. And it's unclear whether or not they will be sent on to their home countries or will be sent on to their home countries to where they'll face further detention. And so this episode concerning the encircling of Algeria is something that we must take seriously, not only because a blow against Algeria would be a blow against anti-imperialism, but I think it's also a way for we on this side of the Atlantic to repay the debt that actually can never be repaid to the people, the heroic people of Algeria.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to ask you about President Trump's mini-summit with the leaders of 5 African countries, which took place last week from July 9th to July 11th in Washington. The Trump administration has characterized this 3-day meeting as a, quote, landmark summit wherein trade, investment, and security were discussed as Washington pivots away from foreign development aid and soft power, and somehow tries to combat China's growing influence on the continent. Attendees at the mini-summit included the leaders of Gabon, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia, Mauritania, and Senegal. During a televised lunch at the White House on Wednesday, the African leaders lavished Trump with praise, while encouraging U.S. economic partnership. Mauritania President Mohamedou Ghazouani was the first head of state to speak and stated that, quote, "In the short time you've been back in office, you came to the rescue for peace." His remarks were echoed by the other heads of state, most of whom made direct comments in support of President Trump being nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. President Trump curiously asserted that the U.S., quote, "treats Africa far better than China or anybody else." But then Trump went on to make a blatantly offensive statement about Liberian President Joseph Bokai's ability to speak, quote, "such good English." English, of course, has been the official language of Liberia since the country's founding in the 1800s as a project of the American Colonization Society. But Dr. Horne, what was your reaction to Trump's mini-summit that took place last week in Washington?
Well, this gives us another bite at the apple with regard to this disgraceful mini-summit. It allows me to raise, number one, the abject ignorance of Mr. Trump probably cannot distinguish Liberia from Siberia, for example. And number two, the not so hidden agenda of this so-called MiniSummit was to encircle the Sahel states, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, because of their really severe and forceful and militant challenge to the hegemony and domination of world imperialism, which fortunately, I'm happy to say, is on a downward spiral. But once again, I think we've reached the end of the road.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.